The ferry, a rust-streaked hulk named the Sea Witch, bucked against the churning grey swells. Grant gripped the cold metal rail, the spray stinging his cheeks. He watched the mainland recede, a smear of green and brown swallowed by the relentless expanse of the ocean. Each nautical mile was a deliberate severing, a physical manifestation of the chasm he felt inside. He'd left behind the polite condolences, the pitying glances, the suffocating quiet of his own home. He'd left the phantom echoes of laughter that no longer belonged to him, the scent of a perfume that lingered only in memory. He was running, yes, but he was also seeking. Seeking a silence so profound it might finally drown out the ceaseless clamor of his grief, a stark isolation that could perhaps forge new words from the ashes of his old life. The island emerged from the mist like a bruised, ancient leviathan, its craggy shores clawed by the ceaseless tide. It wasn't picturesque. There were no verdant fields or quaint fishing villages, only a brooding landscape of wind-scoured rock, skeletal trees bent double by unseen forces, and a sky that seemed permanently bruised. Grant shivered, though not entirely from the cold. The ferry coughed and shuddered its way into a small, dilapidated dock, a skeleton of splintered wood and barnacled pilings. There was no welcoming committee, no bustling port. Only a lone, stoic figure, the island's caretaker, waiting beside a battered utility vehicle. The caretaker, a man whose face was etched with the island's harsh winds and salt, offered Grant a nod that was more a concession than a greeting. His eyes, the color of sea glass, held a depth that Grant found unnerving. They seemed to know things, to have seen too much of the island's grim history. "You're Grant," the caretaker grunted, his voice raspy like dry sand. "Expected you yesterday. Storm held us." Grant merely nodded, pulling his duffel bag from the ferry's hold. The air here was different, thicker than the mainland's, heavy with the scent of brine, damp earth, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old rust mixed with decay. He followed the caretaker to the vehicle, the crunch of gravel under their boots the only sound besides the ceaseless roar of the ocean. The drive was short, bone-jarring. The narrow track, little more than a goat path, wound its way along the precipitous cliffs. Below, the sea crashed against the rocks with a hungry, insatiable sound. Grant stared out the window, his gaze drawn inexorably upward. Perched on the highest, most exposed promontory, silhouetted against the tumultuous sky, stood the abandoned lighthouse. It was a monolith of weathered stone, its lantern room a vacant, unblinking eye. It looked less like a guide and more like a sentinel, watching over a forgotten domain. "Place has a reputation," the caretaker said, his voice cutting through Grant's thoughts. He didn't elaborate, merely grunted and tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The implied warning hung in the air, a sour taste. It was smaller than Grant remembered from the faded photographs and far more derelict. The whitewash had long since peeled away, revealing damp, grey stone. Windows stared out like empty sockets, some boarded up, others merely coated in a grime so thick it rendered them opaque. A single, gnarled tree clawed at the front of the cottage, its branches like skeletal fingers. "Keys are on the hook inside," the caretaker said, gesturing vaguely. "Water's off, but the pump outside still works. Generators in the shed, fuel's topped up. If you need anything, Grant back at the dock. Not that there's much to need out here." He paused, his gaze drifting to the looming, silent tower above. Not a good idea. With that cryptic advice, the caretaker drove off, leaving Grant standing alone in the biting wind, the engine's rumble quickly fading into the pervasive roar of the sea. The sudden silence was absolute, save for the elements. Grant felt a profound sense of isolation settle over him, a weight far heavier than his grief. He was truly alone. He pushed open the cottage door. It groaned in protest, a sound like a long-held breath finally escaping. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that penetrated the grimy windows. Grant ran a hand over a wooden table, leaving a clean streak in the thick layer of grit. Every surface was coated. He walked through the small rooms, his footsteps echoing on the bare floorboards. A rusty stove in the kitchen, a single, threadbare armchair in what might have been a sitting room, a narrow cot in the bedroom. Nothing more. It was exactly what he wanted. A blank slate, an empty vessel. He told himself this, tried to believe it. Yet, as he stood in the bedroom, staring out at the grey expanse of the ocean, a prickle of unease crawled up his neck. He turned, scanning the room, the empty corridor behind him. Nothing. He felt it again, that strange sensation of being watched. Not by a person, but by something far more ancient, far more elemental. The profound isolation that settled over Grant was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, a sensation far heavier than the biting wind. He clutched his duffel bag tighter, the canvas rough against his knuckles, and turned towards the cottage. It loomed, squat and weathered, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the turbulent grey expanse. The front door, a heavy slab of salt-bleached oak, groaned in protest as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone, ancient dust, and something else, a faint metallic tang, like old coins left out in the rain. Grant stepped into a narrow hallway, his boots echoing on the flagstone floor. The cottage was colder inside than out, a chill that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of the walls. He spent the first hour simply walking through the rooms, a grim inventory of his new solitude. The living room offered a view of crashing waves through grimy panes, a threadbare rug covering most of the floorboards, and a stone fireplace choked with ancient ash. The kitchen was Spartan, a rusted iron stove dominating one wall. Upstairs, 2 small bedrooms, each with a single cot, faced the churning ocean. He chose the one with a slightly larger window, pushing aside the brittle lace curtains to gaze out. In the distance, silhouetted against the bruised sky, stood the skeletal frame of the abandoned lighthouse, its broken lantern room a jagged crown. He started to unpack, laying out a few books and a worn journal on a rickety bedside table. As he placed his fountain pen carefully beside them, a faint scratching sound emanated from the wall directly behind the headboard. It was quick, irregular, like fingernails dragging lightly over plaster. Grant paused, pen suspended in air. He waited, listening intently. The sound didn't repeat. He shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. Old house, he thought. Settling, probably a mouse. He dismissed it, attributing it to the cottage's age and the wind whistling through unseen cracks. Later, as dusk began to bleed purple and grey into the sky, Grant found himself in the kitchen, attempting to light the ancient stove. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Fatigue, he decided, and an overactive imagination fueled by the isolation. His determination to find solace here warred with a nascent unease. He was tired, grieving, and alone. His mind was simply playing tricks. He managed to get a kettle of water boiling and made himself a cup of instant coffee, the bitter warmth a small comfort. He carried it to the living room, settling into a surprisingly soft, if musty, armchair. The storm outside had intensified, the wind now a banshee shriek against the windows, the rain a relentless drumming. He picked up one of his books, a collection of poetry, and tried to read. He had placed his coffee cup on a small, round table beside the armchair, setting it precisely on a faded coaster. He read a few pages, the rhythmic drone of the storm a constant backdrop. When he reached for his cup again, his fingers met only empty air. He frowned, looking down. The cup had shifted, not much, perhaps an inch or two, but it was no longer centered on the coaster. It was subtly, undeniably askew. He hadn't touched it since setting it down. The table was sturdy, the floorboards unmoving. He picked up the cup, his thumb brushing the cool ceramic, and deliberately placed it back in its original position, noting its exact spot. Nothing happened. He exhaled slowly, a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The table isn't perfectly level, he reasoned, or perhaps I bumped it without realizing. He tried to dismiss it, to force himself back into the rhythm of the words on the page. He strained to hear it again, but it was gone, lost in the tempest, hollow. He stood in the main room of the cottage, the fading light of the tempest-laden sky filtering through grimy panes, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stagnant air. The only sounds now were the relentless slap of waves against the rocks below and the mournful creak of the old structure settling into its long decay. He forced himself to move, to unpack the few crates he'd brought. The determination that had propelled him to this desolate place, a fragile shield against the encroaching despair, was still present, though it felt thinner, more brittle with each passing minute. He needed to establish order, to impose his will on the chaos of the empty rooms. The act of arranging, of claiming the space, was a small victory against the encroaching vastness outside. Days bled into a rhythm of chores and restless attempts to write. The words wouldn't come, not truly. He spent an afternoon exploring the abandoned lighthouse itself, a towering sentinel of rust and flaking paint. The spiral staircase groaned under his weight, each step echoing in the cavernous shaft. The lantern room at the very top was a skeletal cage of glass and iron, the massive lens long since removed, leaving a gaping, sightless eye to stare out at the indifferent ocean. It smelled of mildew and forgotten things. Inside, behind a stack of brittle, unread ledgers, his fingers brushed against something hard and unexpectedly smooth. He pulled it out, a wooden box, plain and unadorned, secured with a tarnished brass clasp. He carried it to the table, the old armchair groaning in protest as he sat. The clasp yielded with a faint click. Its cover was worn smooth, the corners softened by countless turns of the page. No title, no name, just the faint impression of a compass rose pressed into the aged hide. He hesitated, a silent debate unfolding within him. Was it right to delve into the private world of a long-dead soul? But the island's history, the very air of neglect and foreboding, seemed to demand it. Perhaps this was it. He opened the journal. The ink was faded, the script tight and precise at first, then growing increasingly erratic. The first entry was dated nearly a century ago. October 14th. Another gale. The sea rages, a constant reminder of our smallness. The light holds steady. The early entries chronicled the mundane, weather observations, supply deliveries, the occasional visit from a passing vessel. But subtle shifts began to emerge. November 2nd. The wind carries voices tonight, not the gulls nor the waves, something else, a lament or a call. Grant felt a knot tighten in his stomach. December 1st. The light. It feels different, not a comfort but a lure. Grant watched the ships pass, and sometimes in the periphery, Grant sees shapes in the spray, too large for mere foam. They seemed to follow the beam. His breath hitched. He thought of the unsettling glimmer he'd seen in the water, the way the light from the abandoned lighthouse seemed to draw his gaze not just to the sea but into it. The entries grew shorter, more frantic. The handwriting slanted wildly. January 10th. Grant knew it does. It wants the light. He had felt watched. February 2nd. Sleep offers no escape. The dreams are of the deep, of things that yearn for the surface. And the faces, so many faces in the spray, eyes fixed on the tower. They know Grant see them. Grant's own nights had been plagued by unsettling visions, though he dismissed them as the toll of grief and solitude. The journal entries weren't just a record. They were an echo, a prophecy. The previous keeper's descent was a path he recognized, a path he felt himself already walking. The final pages were barely legible, scratched with desperate urgency. March 5th. It is here, inside. The light is fading, my hope. It is fading too. It feeds on it. It pulls. I can't fight it anymore. The light is not for guiding. It is for attracting. The last entry was a single, jagged line, a frantic scrawl that clawed across the page, ending abruptly. Grant closed the journal, his hands trembling. The room, once a temporary refuge, now felt like a cage. The last entry, a jagged, desperate line, seemed to pulse under Grant's fingertips. He closed the journal, the ancient leather cool and slick against his skin, not with moisture, but with something colder, like a memory of dread. The single letter T at the end, clawed onto the page, felt less like an initial and more like a final, choked gasp. He told himself it was just a man's fevered ramblings, the product of isolation and a failing mind. He had read enough similar accounts in his research for his own work. Yet the tremor in his hands was undeniable. He stood, pushing away from the small, scarred desk. The wind outside had picked up, a low, keening wail that seemed to carry 1,000 forgotten voices. Swats of bruised purple and angry grey clouds raced across the horizon, consuming the last vestiges of daylight. A storm was brewing, a true island tempest, the kind that lashed the coastlines into a frenzy. He made coffee, the rich, bitter smell a welcome distraction. He stacked a few logs by the hearth. He kept replaying the journal entries, the slow descent into madness, the cryptic references to the light and the hunger. It was just a story, he insisted, a tragic narrative of a man broken by solitude. Then came the sound, a faint, dragging scrape from the floor above, directly over his head. He froze, his mug halfway to his lips. He listened, straining. Nothing, just the wind rattling the panes. He dismissed it as the old house settling or a branch scraping the roof. But a moment later, a distinct thud resonated from the same spot, heavier this time, like something substantial had fallen. He hesitated, then climbed the creaking stairs. He moved towards the bedroom that had been the previous keeper's. The door stood ajar just as he'd left it. He pushed it open fully, stepping inside. The room was undisturbed. The bed was neatly made, small chipped dresser in its usual place. Nothing had fallen. He checked the floor, ran a hand along the wall. He was tired, he reasoned, stressed. The isolation was getting to him, just as it had gotten to the keeper. He needed to clear his head. But as he looked out the bedroom window, the sea was already a churning chaos of whitecaps and dark water, the sky a suffocating blanket of storm clouds. No boat would be leaving the dock today or tomorrow. He descended, a knot tightening in his stomach. He kept glancing over his shoulder, convinced he was being watched. The silence stretched, taut and expectant, until it was broken by a whisper. It was soft, barely audible, like dry leaves skittering across stone. It wasn't a word, not exactly, but a sound, a breathy, drawn-out sigh that seemed to curl around the edges of his hearing, a sound that resonated with a profound, aching grief. It was a sound he knew, sound that tore at the fabric of his carefully constructed composure. It was the sound of her last breath, a memory he had fought to bury, now unearthed and echoing in the very air around him. His hands shook, dropping the knife onto the cutting board with a clatter. He gripped the counter, knuckles white. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't his imagination. This was pointed, malicious. It was a claw reaching for his deepest wound. The entity wasn't just a presence in the house. It was inside his head, plucking at the raw nerves of his past. He stumbled back, needing air, needing space. He grabbed his coat, pulling it on with frantic urgency. The wind tore at him, stinging his eyes with salt spray. Rain lashed down, thick and relentless, instantly soaking through his coat. He could barely see, the world reduced to a blur of gray and white. But through the swirling chaos, a distant, faint glow pulsed. The abandoned lighthouse. Its beam, long extinguished, seemed to flicker in his peripheral vision, a phantom light in the heart of the tempest. He felt an undeniable pull, a terrifying magnetism. He had to go there. He didn't know why, but the island, the storm, the entity, all seemed to be drawing him towards that desolate tower. He fought his way across the treacherous, uneven ground, the wind a physical force trying to push his back. The path was slick with mud and seaweed, the air thick with the smell of brine and damp earth. Each step was a battle. As he neared the base of the tower, the sound of the wind intensified, funneling through the cracked windows and broken lantern room like a monstrous throat. The structure loomed, a skeletal finger pointing to the ravaged sky. He pushed against the rusted iron door, which groaned open with a shriek that was almost lost in the storm's fury. He pulled out his phone, its weak beam slicing through the gloom, revealing peeling paint, spiderwebs like tattered flags, the endless, winding ascent. He began to climb, the metallic tang of fear sharp in his mouth. Each step on the corroded iron felt precarious, threatening to give way. The wind howled through unseen gaps, creating a symphony of moans and whistles. They seemed to writhe, to coalesce for an instant, then dissipate. Halfway up, he paused, gasping for breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. The beam of his phone flickered, threatening to die. A faint, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. It wasn't water. It was too regular, too deliberate. He shined his light upwards, but the beam couldn't penetrate the inky blackness. Then he felt it. It wasn't a gust of wind. And with that touch, a thought, clear as a bell, resonated in his mind, not in words, but in an overwhelming sense of understanding. It feeds on what you lose. The revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow. The entity wasn't just attracted to despair. It cultivated it, drawing sustenance from the raw, open wounds of grief. And it had chosen him, a man already adrift in sorrow, as its next meal. The storm outside raged, trapping him, isolating him. The island, once a promise of peace, had become a prison, and the lighthouse, meant to ward off danger, was now the very heart of it, a beacon for something that hungered for the light of his fading hope. He was alone, utterly and irrevocably, with an entity that knew his name, his past, and the precise flavor of his pain. The single letter T at the end of the final journal entry seemed to pulse, a raw, unfinished wound on the page. Grant's fingers, still tracing its jagged contour, felt the ancient leather grow colder, as if the dread etched into the ink had seeped into the material itself. He closed the journal with a soft thud, the sound swallowed by the persistent groan of the storm-battered cottage. He rose, pacing the cramped living space, the floorboards groaning in protest beneath his weight. The storm, a relentless sculptor of the island's jagged coastline, clawed at the walls, a hungry beast trying to tear its way inside. But the real gnawing was happening within him, a burgeoning certainty that the island's tragedies were not mere acts of nature, nor coincidences of fate. The early entries spoke of loneliness, of the crushing isolation that defined a keeper's life. But then, a subtle shift. Later, the keeper wrote of the creeping despair, a pervasive melancholy that settled over the island, especially during prolonged storms. Grant remembered his own initial days, the quiet unease that had transformed into gnawing anxiety. He flipped through the brittle pages, his eyes scanning for recurring themes. Shipwrecks, yes, but not just the usual hazards of the sea. There were descriptions of vessels driven onto the rocks on clear nights, their crews found later, adrift in their lifeboats, staring blankly at the sky, their minds shattered. Vanishing islanders, too, not washed away, but simply gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of fear. It grows with each shattered mind, each despairing breath exhaled into the salt air. Not the physical light of the lighthouse, but the light within people, their hope, their reason. An ancient, parasitic consciousness. The term resonated with a profound, sickening truth. It wasn't a creature of flesh and blood, but something far more insidious, something that preyed on the very essence of human resilience. He looked up, his gaze drawn to a faint, uneven patch of plaster on the wall beside the fireplace. It was slightly discolored, a shade lighter than the surrounding stone, and barely noticeable unless one was specifically looking for anomalies. He ran his hand over it. The surface felt subtly different, smoother, less textured. He pressed, and a small section gave way with a faint click, revealing a shallow cavity behind it. Inside, nestled amongst a crumbling layer of dust, was a small, lead-bound box. It was tarnished, embossed with a strange, swirling symbol that seemed to writhe under his touch. He fumbled with the clasp, his breath catching in his throat. It sprang open, revealing not jewels or documents, but a single, ancient, dried-out piece of parchment. Unfolding it carefully, Grant saw a crude, hand-drawn map of the island. But it wasn't a navigational chart. It was marked with concentric circles, radiating outwards from the exact location of the abandoned lighthouse. And within the outermost circle, a series of tiny, almost imperceptible darts, each accompanied by a date. He cross-referenced them mentally with the journal entries. Every dart corresponded to a major shipwreck or disappearance. The lighthouse wasn't just a dwelling or a warning. It was the epicenter. The symbol on the box, he now realized, was repeated at the very heart of the map, right where the abandoned lighthouse stood. The entity wasn't merely on the island. It was inextricably bound to the lighthouse itself. The structure, designed to ward off danger, was in fact drawing it in, amplifying whatever malevolent force lurked within. The very light meant to save was a lure, not for ships, but for despair. Grant's mind reeled. He had come here seeking solace, a quiet corner to mend his own fractured spirit. Instead, he had stumbled into the lair of something ancient, something that had been patiently harvesting the broken dreams and shattered minds of countless souls. The storm outside seemed to intensify, its roar no longer just wind and rain, but a chorus of hungry voices, echoing the parasitic consciousness that now, he knew, had set its sights on him. The T in the journal, he understood now, wasn't just a letter. It was a marker, a tally, and he was next. The cold knot that had formed in Grant's stomach after reading the old keeper's journal tightened into a hard, aching stone. Not the physical beam cutting through the storm, but the internal luminescence, the spark of hope, the stubborn will to persist. An ancient, parasitic consciousness, the journal had called it. The phrase resonated with a profound, sickening truth. It wasn't a creature of flesh or bone, but of shadow and despair, a thing that burrowed into the mind, corrupting from within. The cottage, once a refuge, began to feel like a cage. The storm outside, which had been a distant rumble, now raged with a personal fury, lashing the windows with sleet and salt spray. Grant stood by the rattling pane, watching the tumultuous graze of the ocean, the white foam tearing at the rocks. He imagined the previous keeper, alone in this very room, succumbing to the same insidious assault. A faint scent drifted into the room, something floral and sweet, a ghost of honeysuckle and jasmine. His breath hitched. It was her scent, the perfume he had always worn. He whirled, scanning the small space. Nothing. Only the familiar clutter of his temporary life, stacks of books, a half-empty mug of tea, his laptop. He knew it was a trick, a manipulation, yet the phantom fragrance clung to the air, pulling at a raw, exposed nerve. Then came the sound. A soft, melodic hum, just at the edge of hearing, like a forgotten lullaby. It was the tune she used to hum while she worked, a private melody shared only between them. He clamped his hands over his ears, shaking his head. "No," he muttered, his voice hoarse, a desperate plea against the encroaching tide of memory. "It's not real." But the hum persisted, weaving itself into the shrieking wind, growing clearer, more insistent, until it seemed to emanate from the very walls. The room began to subtly shift. The flame of the oil lamp on his desk flickered wildly, though there was no draft. A framed photograph, one he'd placed face down to avoid the constant ache, seemed to vibrate where it lay. It was a picture of her, smiling, her eyes bright with a joy he now rarely recalled. Then, a flicker at the periphery of his vision. A movement by the doorway, a flash of pale fabric, the hem of a dress. He spun around. Only the empty frame of the door leading to the narrow hallway. His heart hammered, a frantic drum against his ribs. You couldn't save her. He stumbled back, hitting the wall. The words clawed at him, tearing at the meticulously constructed facade of his self-blame. He knew it was a lie, a distortion born of the entity's hunger, but the pain was real, the memory of her last moments a gaping wound. He saw it now, not as a memory, but as a vivid, horrifying hallucination. The thrashing waves, the overturned vessel, the desperate, reaching hand. Her face, pale and distant, receding into the churning grey. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to banish the image, but it only intensified, playing out behind his eyelids with sickening clarity. The salt spray on his face, the bitter taste of fear, the crushing weight of helplessness. He gasped, a guttural sound torn from his throat, his body convulsing as if he were drowning all over again. When he opened his eyes, the cottage was no longer merely shifting. The floorboards beneath his feet felt unstable, pitching like a ship on a tempestuous sea. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, the wood groaning like a dying beast. He could hear the distinct sound of dripping water, though no leak was visible, a steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip that echoed the relentless passage of time, of hope eroding. He stumbled towards the window again, desperate for the solid, unchanging reality of the island, but even that was warped. The abandoned lighthouse, usually a stoic sentinel against the storm, now seemed to writhe. "You're tired, Grant, so very tired. Let go." He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, the chill a welcome anchor in the swirling chaos of his mind. He was tired, yes, bone-deep weary from the fight he hadn't even known he was in. But he wasn't broken. Not yet. He remembered the journal, the old keeper's frantic scrawl. He forced himself to take a slow, ragged breath, focusing on the simple, mundane details. The condensation on the glass, the faint smell of his own sweat, the rough texture of the window frame beneath his fingers. This wasn't her. This was the entity, wearing her voice, her scent, her memory like a mask. The cottage shuddered violently, throwing him off balance. A sharp crack echoed from the ceiling, and a fine shower of plaster dust drifted down. The storm outside intensified its howl, and through the din he heard it, a low, guttural moan that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the island, a sound of ancient, boundless hunger. He was fighting for his sanity, for his very soul against a foe that knew his every weakness, every regret. And the battle had only just begun. The journal, clutched in Grant's damp hand, felt like a fragile, ancient key. Its final, frantic entry, barely legible through smears and fading ink, spoke not of banishment, but of starvation. The light guides, but also traps. The old keeper had scrawled, "It feeds on the echo. Drown the echo, sever the thread, remember the other shore." Cryptic, desperate, but a thread of hope nonetheless. Grant pressed his thumb against the faded script, a cold resolve hardening in his chest. But he wasn't broken, not yet. He pushed open the heavy, salt-corroded door of the abandoned lighthouse. The sound was a drawn-out shriek of tortured metal, swallowed almost immediately by the wind's relentless howl. The air inside was colder than the night, heavy with the scent of rust, damp stone, and something else, a stale, pervasive melancholy that seemed to cling to the very air. The spiraling iron staircase, a skeletal spine ascending into the gloom, stretched above him, each step a rusted declaration of decay. As he began his climb, the wind found new ways to torment him, whistling through unseen cracks, sighing like 1,000 lost voices. They were not words, not precisely, but suggestions of words, fragments of forgotten laments, the faint, sorrowful echoes of despair. He pushed on, his breath growing ragged. The ascent was long, arduous. He saw flashes then, not with his eyes, but in his mind's eye. The grey, churning waters of a memory he fought daily to suppress, the faces of those lost, their eyes wide with final, silent accusation. The entity was trying to drown him in the very echoes the keeper had warned against. Drown the echo. He focused on the other shore, the life he'd left behind, the warmth, the laughter, the connection. He clung to the vivid, sun-drenched memory of his partner's smile, the gentle pressure of their hand in his, the scent of their hair. He would not let the entity twist these into instruments of despair. Higher and higher he climbed. The wind outside grew ferocious, rattling the glass panes of the lantern room above, a discordant symphony of a world breaking apart. The very structure of the abandoned lighthouse seemed to protest his presence, groaning, shifting, sending down showers of rust flakes. The entity's presence was a palpable weight now, a suffocating blanket of misery. It tried to flood his mind with the futility of his quest, the sheer, crushing loneliness of his existence on this remote island. You are alone. You will always be alone. There is no other shore for you. Grant reached the final, narrow ladder, its rungs slick with sea spray that had somehow breached the sealed room. He pulled himself up, muscles screaming, and stumbled onto the circular platform of the lantern room. The space was desolate. The massive Fresnel lens, once a beacon of hope, was shattered in places, coated in salt and grime, its intricate prisms reflecting nothing but the dim, storm-filtered light. The entity was concentrated here, a swirling vortex of despair, formless yet overwhelmingly present. It pulsed with the accumulated sorrow of all the lives lost, all the hopes dashed against the island's jagged teeth. This was its heart, its anchor, its feeding ground. He could feel the entity pressing in, a crushing weight on his chest, a freezing hand on his soul. It showed him the faces of the shipwrecked, their eyes empty, their hands reaching, pulling him down into their watery graves. "Sever the thread," he murmured, his voice hoarse but steady. He remembered the keeper's final, desperate instruction. The thread wasn't physical. It was the connection, the resonance of despair. The journal described a simple, defiant act, to speak a name, a truth, into the heart of the echo, to call forth a memory untainted by the island's gloom, and to hold it against the rising tide of sorrow. Grant took a deep, shuddering breath. He focused on his partner's face, clear and vibrant in his mind, not as a source of pain, but as a source of enduring love. He remembered their laughter, the quiet comfort of their presence, the shared dreams. He repeated the name, louder, firmer, pouring all his love, all his grief, all his hope into the sound. "Elara!" The entity recoiled. The wind outside howled like a wounded beast. Grant pushed harder, refusing to let the despair claim this memory. He wasn't just remembering, he was offering it, a defiant counterpoint to the loneliness it craved. He wasn't alone. He carried a connection, a love that transcended the island's bleak embrace. The entity wasn't gone, he knew. But its suffocating hold on the lantern room, its desperate feeding on the echoes of the lost, had been disrupted. The thread, for now, was severed. He stood there, trembling, utterly spent, but a strange, fragile lightness bloomed in his chest. He had faced it, armed with nothing but a name and a memory, and for now, he had driven it back. The fight was far from over, but a new, desperate resolve had taken root in the desolate heart of the island. The entity recoiled, a shriek of silent agony tearing through the air, felt more than heard, a vibration that rattled Grant's teeth. The malevolent cold intensified for a moment, a desperate, lashing surge, as if trying to extinguish the word, to silence the memory that had burst from his lips. The broken lens around him shuddered, throwing distorted shadows that writhed like dying things. The very structure of the abandoned lighthouse groaned, a deep, resonant sound, like an ancient beast in its death throes. Grant stood, gasping, the taste of salt and fear thick in his mouth. He had spoken her name, not in grief, but in defiant love, a memory of warmth and laughter, a beacon against the encroaching despair. It was the antithesis of the entity's sustenance. He had felt it flinch, felt the sudden, desperate scramble of its ethereal tendrils. But it was not vanquished. The retreat was momentary, a tactical withdrawal, not a defeat. Then it surged again, not with physical force, but with a torrent of pure, unadulterated anguish. It wasn't just his grief now. It was the collective sorrow of every soul lost to these merciless waters, every ship that foundered, every hope that drowned. His own despair, a familiar, comfortable shroud, threatened to consume him, to offer him to the entity as its final, most delicious meal. But the flicker of defiance, sparked by that remembered name, refused to die. He clutched the rough, salt-encrusted metal of the railing, digging his fingers into the rust. This wasn't just about his sorrow anymore. This was about her. About the light she represented, the light he had almost let fade entirely. He looked up at the shattered lantern room, at the few remaining shards of thick glass. They were fractured, useless as a true beacon, but they still caught the faint, bruised light of the pre-dawn sky, refracting it into fractured rainbows of weak color. He pushed against the psychic assault, focusing not on the despair, but on the memory itself, not the loss, but the having. The entity screamed again, a soundless scream of pure rage, as if a vital cord had been severed. Grant understood then. The entity wasn't just drawn to the lighthouse. It was anchored here to the accumulated tragedy, to the fading light. It fed on the absence of hope, the surrender to sorrow. The lighthouse, meant to guide, had become its hunting ground, a place where the light of human spirit often dimmed before the final plunge. They were the true guardians, the ones who kept the spiritual flame from guttering out completely. He looked at the broken lens, at the mechanism that once spun with such precision. It was too far gone to repair quickly, but he didn't need a perfect beacon, needed a beacon. Not a naive hope, but a grim, determined, defiant hope. With a surge of strength he didn't know he possessed, Grant grabbed a heavy, rusted crank handle lying discarded on the floor. It was part of the old lamp-turning mechanism. He ignored the pain in his hands, the burning in his lungs. He didn't know if it would work, but he had to try. He positioned the crank, wedging it into a remaining cog. Then he turned it, forcing the rusted gears to grind, to move, to turn the shattered fragments of the lens. The sound was agonizing, metal screaming against metal, but as the broken glass began to slowly revolve, catching the first, faint rays of the rising sun, something shifted. And with each sweep the entity shrieked, a soundless, tearing agony. It was not the intensity of the light, but its movement, its purpose, its defiance of stagnation that burned it. It was the deliberate act of turning, of trying to shine, even when broken. It was not vanquished, Grant knew, not truly. He collapsed, the heavy crank handle falling from his numb fingers. He was utterly spent, his body aching, his mind reeling, but he was alive. And the island, for the first time since his arrival, felt quieter, still menacing, yes, still burdened, but the immediate, suffocating presence was gone. The cost, however, was immense. The entity had branded him. He was no longer just Grant, the grieving rider. He was a sentinel, guardian of a terrible secret. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. He staggered to the edge of the lantern room, looking out at the churning sea. The storm had broken, leaving behind a sky of bruised purples and grays, with a sliver of defiant orange on the horizon. The mainland was a distant, hazy line. He could leave. He could pack his things, take the next boat, and never look back. He could try to forget, to pretend this terrifying ordeal had never happened, but he knew he couldn't. The entity was still here, dormant, waiting, and he now carried the knowledge of its existence, its hunger. To leave would be to abandon a post he had unknowingly inherited. He looked at his own trembling hands, at the calluses forming on his palms. He would stay. He would mend the light, not just the physical lamp, but the spiritual one. He would become the island's new keeper, its solitary guardian, forever haunted, forever changed. It was a heavy, permanent burden, a life sentence, but it was a sentence he would serve with grim determination. He would ensure that the fading beacon of hope, however small, would never again be fully extinguished, not on his watch.